Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another Gen 7 UU breakdown, where I'm going to be going over another good game I played in the last couple of days, though this one is significantly different than the last video I posted, despite the fact that we have our old friend Infernape here, a favorite of mine, and a favorite of all people who are kind of at what you might think of as an impressionable age when Gen 4 came out. This is the Pokemon I picked as my starter in Gen 4, for example. And those Pokemon, just as a side note, tend to be very popular, even in competitive. Nobody's immune to it. Everyone loves playing Pokemon that are important to them. But beyond that, first thing I'm going to start with is team composition. I have Choice Band Infernape. I have Specially Defensive Tentacruel, the sort of standard Tentacruel. I have Cleric Sylveon. That's really the only set this Pokemon plays. I have Choice Scarf Crocodile. I have Mega Aggron. And another Pokemon near and dear to my heart. We all know him. Some of us love him. Everyone should love him, I think. Snorlax. Snorlax, as I mentioned before, has been around for a long, long time, since Gen 1, and he's always done the same thing. He's always been a setup sweeper. He's always used Curse. He's always been bulky and hard to kill. And even in Gen 7, he's got all those traits. Now, on my opponent's side, I don't know what items they're playing at the start of this game. How could I? And I don't know what sets they're playing, so I'm going to refrain from saying those for the time being, because in a moment, I'm going to want you, the viewer, to kind of make a decision about who's favored this game. They have, from right to left, Stallbreaker Crobat would be what I'd expect, sort of the taunt, super fang, toxic Crobat. They have Manectric Mega, they have Suicune, they have Scizor of some variety. This is a particularly ambiguous Pokemon, and one whose set is going to change a lot of how this game goes. So that's a particularly important one to be keeping in mind for you. They have Latias, also of some variety, a bit unpredictable like Scizor, though most tend to be the attacking or Calm Mind variety. And Calm Mind, I'm just going to give you a tip here, I think is a little bit unlikely when they have Suicune on their team as well. This Pokemon is an almost obligatory Calm Mind Pokemon, so I'd really doubt that they play two. They could, you never know I suppose, but it's just something to factor into your considerations. And they're playing Crocodile. So take a minute, decide what you think their lead is going to be, how you think this game is going to shake out, and sort of who you think has an advantage right from the team preview. So I'll give you a moment. Please pause the video if you want some time to consider, maybe look up some sets, do some calcs. Those are all good things to do for your own practice in playing Pokemon Showdown, and just as an intellectual exercise. So I'll give you a moment to do that. Take a couple more moments, finalize your decisions. Alright, you got an idea? So, I think I have an advantage from Team Select. And that's a little strange if you've been thinking about how this game is going to play out. They have such a strong pivoting core. They have the classic Volt-Turn combination of Manectric Mega and Scizor, because most Scizors are turners at some level or another. And they also have some secondary pivots. They have Crocodile, they have Crobat, and these Pokemon can pivot as well, because they can threaten something and then switch out immediately. They can rep a knockoff in the case of Crocodile, and that's very annoying for a lot of Pokemon. So their team is so much more mobile than mine, whereas mine is a little bit flat-footed. Tentacruel doesn't get out of play that easily. Sylveon certainly doesn't get out of play that easily, and nor really do Aggron and Snorlax. So if they were able to rely on their pivoting to wear me down, they have I believe they have a Stealth Rock's advantage, because their Stealth Rock setter is better against my Stealth Rock setter. Aggron can do pretty good damage to Crocodile, but Aggron getting worn down is just such a bummer. It can be hard when this Pokemon is at about 30 or 20% to successfully pass a wish from Sylveon onto it, because there are a lot of Pokemon that can do about that amount of damage on their team against Aggron. So it would be a big risk for me to try to heal it up if we were just exchanging rocks. And Crocodile is a Pokemon that carries less power on their team than Aggron does on mine. So if they can get even a slightly uneven trade against my Aggron with their Crocodile, let's say they leave my Aggron at maybe 20% or so, and I kill their Crocodile, then I would say that that's a totally favorable trade for them, because they've nullified a very important Pokemon on my team. But despite all that, I think I have a big advantage, because I have Snorlax. If you look at Setup Sweeper versus Setup Sweeper, Suicune versus Snorlax, there's a problem. Snorlax has reliable recovery, whereas Suicune does not. This one especially so, because it's playing the Recycle Berry variety, and not the Sleep Talking variety. What I mean by that is, I'm playing a move called Recycle, which not everybody may know, but it brings back your berry, or whatever item you happen to consume, when you've consumed it. And I'm also playing a berry that will store 50% of this Pokemon's substantial HP pool. So in essence, I have Recover, but sort of a slow, delayed, and slightly strange Recover, whereas the Suicune either has to lean on Sleep Talking, if it's playing Rest and Sleep Talk, or it has to rely entirely on its leftovers. This is what you'd call Crocoon. So, assuming we both try to set up, and that's always a risk, because even if you end up a turn behind, if you switch in your setup sweeper and start to set up, and they switch in their setup sweeper the first turn that you use a setup move, you're eventually going to be facing off at 4x boosts. You may get a move in there kind of on the side, but typically when you're playing a setup sweeper, that's a little bit less important. You'll have to wear down their setup guy, while their setup guy wears you down. And in those advantages, Snorlax has a big advantage. In those realms, I should say, Snorlax has a big advantage. So that being said, as far as Pokemon to lead, I make the decision to lead my Choice Scarf Crocodile and not my Mega Aggron for the reason that I think they're very likely to start their Rock Setter, Crocodile. And I would rather have a Pokemon that can kind of threaten it a little and harry it first before trying to get right down to it. That being said, let's start the video. They send out their Crocodile as predicted. I send in mine. We intimidate each other, because that's what crocodiles do. And I decide to knock off their Focus Sash, just to get it out of the way. They assume my Crocodile is playing rocks like theirs is, and they taunt me. So I can't set up rocks against them. Because as I mentioned previously, rocks is going to be... Well, I didn't mention this previously, but I'll mention it now. Rocks is very annoying for a U-turning team, because every time you switch, you take damage. And Manectric isn't a particularly bulky Pokemon to begin with. And Scissor, it is bulky, but it uses its bulk a lot to kind of take hits and then deal big hits back. So having its health reduced can be extremely impactful for a Pokemon like Scissor, who will be switching into moves a lot that it resists. And losing 12% of its HP every time makes those moves hurt a lot more, relatively. So they make the decision to... They assume we're going to Speed Tie. They want to taunt me just to totally obviate the possibility that I put down Stealth Rock as much as I can. And it turns out that that wasn't even a risk at all. I just wanted to get Intimidate and knock this Pokemon Sash off. And they taunt my Crocodile. Crocodile switches out into Aggron. They set up rocks. And they taunt my Aggron to make sure I can't set up rocks in my Aggron, now that they've figured out what's going on. I rip a Heavy Slam onto it, predicting the taunt. They Earthquake me and deal a bit of damage. And I smoosh the Crocodile. So now they send a Manectric, which is threatening a Fire-type move, and Volt Switch. So I respect that and send in Crocodile, who absorbs a Volt Switch straight up, as it does there, and who would be able to take a ground move or two. They switch in Crocodile. Crobat. I do the same thing as last time and knock off the Crobat's item. I hit it again, thinking it might Brave Bird, but it roosts. So they actually maybe thought I was going to switch there, but I didn't. I knocked off one more time, just to be unpredictable. I switch in Sylveon to their Manectric, because Sylveon isn't too worried about what Manectric does typically. It's all going to be less than 50% of Sylveon's health, and it can wish that back up. But something very annoying happens here, and I get paralyzed. So, this early game has not gone very well for me. They've gotten Stealth Rock down. I killed one of their Pokemon, I suppose, but that's sort of what you expect Setup Crocodile to do, and that's why I didn't want to start my Aggron in general. Because this Pokemon is not incredibly impactful to their team. I do think it was a mistake for them to let it go so easily. But what they expected to do is to set up rocks to annoy another setup Pokemon, like, let's say, if you're playing Azelf or Frostlass, Crocodile can be pretty annoying for those Pokemon. And then they switch in, then they want to bring in their Manectric for free and start pivoting around with rocks up. So getting paralyzed on my Sylveon here is annoying because it's something that walls a lot of their Pokemon, and it forces my Sylveon out. And they kind of annoyingly read my switch in from Crocodile. I make a bad read thinking they'll bring Crobat in to immune an Earthquake, but they don't. They just stick it out. And they end up bringing down my Crocodile too. Now, this is the first and only time I bring in Infernape this game, because Infernape just typically isn't very good against their team. But I've made sort of a strategy level decision in my mind where I've decided to respect their options. I'm not going to try to read them anymore, now that my read hasn't worked out. I used Stone Edge there and they didn't do what I wanted them to do. I thought they would bring in Crobat like they did last time to potentially absorb a knockoff, even though knockoff wouldn't be terribly threatening to Manectric, so I probably shouldn't have been considering that. But if I were them, the level 1 thing to expect from Crocodile is an Earthquake, which is going to kill a fragile Pokemon like Manectric. But they decided to take that risk and just kill my Crocodile in the case that I tried to make a read. And I did, and it ended up with me losing my Pokemon and them not losing theirs. And so I think they're making a good decision when they're behind. They try to play around me getting a little bit fancy, and it works out very well for them, as you can see. So now I've decided to respect my opponent, to respect their options, and I bring in my Infernape to clean up this Manectric, because getting Manectric out of the way would be very nice. It really limits a lot of their capability to generate momentum. So I bring in my Infernape here, I hit Mach Punch, and they wisely switch into Latias, which Infernape doesn't threaten nearly at all. So I just pull back my Infernape, I bring in a Pokemon that's pretty effective against Latias generally, and there's some risk of getting Fire Blasted in that scenario. So if you were them, I think you probably realize that the most likely Pokemon for me to bring in here is Aggron. Sylveon would be another consideration, but Sylveon is already quite low, and depending on what set this Latias is playing, Latias could chip it down. So I decided just to put in Aggron to absorb a Draco Meteor. It would take about maybe 25% from that, or it takes even less from Psyshock, because Psyshock checks your physical defense, and if you couldn't tell, this Pokemon's physical defense is quite high. And just accept that if I get Fire Blasted, I get Fire Blasted. And it turns out that's not what they're doing anyway. I, again, kind of following my decision earlier to just respect their options, use Heavy Slam to obviate the possibility that their Latias has Fire Blast. They switch in Suicune, and now Suicune tries to generate some buffs. So this is where things, I think, maybe went a little bit wrong for them. They went off of the keeping up momentum plan and onto the trying to set up plan. And while the setting up plan is tempting on paper, because once Suicune is going, you basically just win the game, there's a big hair in the soup here for them, this Tentacruel. If you don't know, Tentacruel very typically plays a move called Haze, which will take off all these buffs they've accumulated. And you're going to see in just a moment that's exactly what I do. However, before I do that, since this Suicune doesn't really threaten my Tentacruel immediately, I decide to get rid of Stealth Rock to stop taking residual damage. So I haze their buffs off, I get rid of rocks, and they don't really have anything to show for it. So they've really given up a ton of their momentum here for the sake of trying to set up a Pokemon that's not going to threaten this Pokemon anyway. And that's something to really keep in mind when using a setup sweeper. Can I sweep? What is my time frame for doing so? What are the checks and counters to my setup sweeper? And you're going to see in a moment, I'm going to play in a different way with my setup sweeper. I'm going to play a lot more carefully and a lot more speculatively, just trying to figure out what exactly the checks and counters are. And maybe that's what they're doing to the Suicune too, but they left it in just a little bit too long, and maybe Rapid Spin is something they should have respected in the first place, and brought in something like Manectric again to threaten my Tentacruel if it does that, to not give it a chance to inflict more damage than it already has, because Tentacruel can damage a lot of the Pokemon on their team, specifically their two pivots, Manectric and Scizor. Scizor in particular can be worried about Scald, because it has a 30% chance to burn it, which really takes a Choice Banded Scizor out of the game. And I'm still not quite sure what set they're playing yet, but again, I would mostly suspect Choice Band. So they see that this Suicune isn't going to do much. I somewhat foolishly haze again. I think I could have realized that Manectric was coming in. And now, given that my Sylveon is weakened, I use another Pokemon to absorb a few hits, my Snorlax. And I stack a boost here. So this is an important moment. This in particular is sort of the key difference in how I played my setup sweeper versus theirs. I don't know if this Scizor is playing Superpower or not. And Superpower, even with 1.5 times my defense, will one-shot me. You'll see that in the calcs over here. It does 60 to 70% of my health. I think that given how this game is shaken out so far, and all the momentum I reclaimed by getting rid of rocks and hazing their Suicune, I can afford to be patient. I can afford to see whether or not this Pokemon has Superpower. Because I think if they had it, they would probably use it here. Because letting this, fooling around with a Choice Banded Pokemon is not usually a good idea, because then you get locked to your move. Like, they could use Bullet Punch here, for example, if they had both Bullet Punch and they had Superpower. And if I decided to call them on their bluff and just keep stacking up defensive boosts, that would end very badly for me, because then to threaten me again, they have to switch into a Pokemon and then switch back to the Scizor. So that's one of the disadvantages of playing a choice item in general. It forces you to be a little bit predictable in order to have the maximum effect with your Pokemon. That being said, I decide not to call them on their bluff, and just to respect the chance that they have superpower, and switch in a Pokemon that wouldn't be very worried about that, my Tentacruel. So I pull out my Snorlax, I put in Tentacruel, and this tells me two things. This tells me, A, that they're choice scarfed, or choice banded, sorry, because that's how much damage with a choice band they would do to this Tentacruel, and B, that they probably don't have superpower for the reasons that I mentioned. They still could, maybe they have a different philosophy, they want to conceal the fact that they have superpower for as long as possible so I get complacent, but I think that's less likely than them simply just not having it. Superpower is a tempting move to cut from Scissor because it's a little bit narrow, and when you make a bad prediction with it, you have to switch out your Scissor, and it just gets a little bit ugly, so often people will, but that, based on sort of the texture of this game, is what I've started to deduce. That this Scissor doesn't really have superpower and can't really threaten a setup Snorlax. So they decide just to rip a couple more bullet punches, maybe get lucky. They don't get burned on that Scald, and I decide that enough is enough on my Tentacruel. I'll just switch in a Pokemon that can take bullet punches really comfortably, and they switch out their Scissor, they bring in Suicune again, and yeah, that's why I switch in Aggron. Aggron one-shots their Scissor. They switch in their Suicune and start to set up again. I bring in Sylveon to try to pass a wish to the Snorlax to totally obviate any possibility that it gets one-shot by a Scissor, assuming I have one boost under me, and I very annoyingly get full paralyzed. Now they decide that since this Tentacruel is going to haze off their boosts, they might as well use them or lose them, and they take out my Sylveon, who got fully paralyzed another time after that. So, annoying, but no big deal. It's important not to let those small things fluster you. Now Tentacruel hazes again, gets scalded for very little damage. It's a very defensive Pokemon, it resists water. I switch into Snorlax because I see my chance to eat my berry and get back up to a percent where the Scissor won't worry me, given that I don't think it has superpower. They switch in Scissor. I get a curse under me to live the superpower that might be coming. I don't think it will, though. They U-turn out, fully confirming in my mind they don't have superpower. I recycle my berry, I go back under 50%, eat it, go up to 100, and now we're pretty much good to go. Psyshock not worrying, because I have some curse boosts. I get my berry back again, just to be completely safe. I get one more curse under me, because 2x is usually where you want to be at before you start getting going. They taunt me, just a little bit too late. Their Crobat gets one shot, and things are looking pretty wrapped up from here. Scissor, even if it did have superpower wouldn't one-shot my Snorlax at this point. This Snorlax also playing Fire Punch, so I cleanly take down Scissor. They bring in Manectric, lower my attack a little bit. They switch in Latias. They might be trying to pivot around and lower my Snorlax attack, but it's just a little bit too late. They bring in their Suicune, but my Pokemon is set up and theirs isn't. Yeah, Scald, it's just not a big deal. I deal about 50% to their Suicune on the crackback, and they decide at this point that they've had enough and that the game is over. So this is what I was talking about earlier, with the Snorlax being so threatening to their team, especially since they didn't have a strong fighting move to take it out. One thing that I think really would have increased their odds of winning this game is if they kept more in mind what I wanted to do with my Snorlax. Because you'll see, particularly at the end there, like, let's go back a few turns. Whoops, that's the wrong button. Let's see, let's go to turn 35, when I'm still getting set up. Maybe a few turns before this. Yeah, okay. So here's where Snorlax eats its berry. So they should have a lot of information about what I want to do from here. And especially if they don't have superpower on their Scissor, they should switch in Crobat and taunt me and start Super Fanging, just to reduce the pain as much as possible. But they don't. They bring in this Scissor that can't actually threaten my Snorlax. Even in the best case, if they did have superpower, I would be able to get 2 boosts or just recycle my berry over and over again and weather their superpowers while their attack steadily goes down. And then they make the switch to Latias, which just completely can't do anything to Snorlax. So they had some problems this game, and I think once the Snorlax was in and started going, it was pretty much curtains. The game ended very soon after this, after all. But being a little more on top of my Snorlax with their Crobat, I think they would have been well served to do. Another thing that I think really would have increased their chances of winning this game is if they didn't use this Suicune until the dust had cleared. If they didn't try to set up sweep my team, they did it twice actually, nearly, while I still had this Tentacruel able to phase it. I think they lost a lot of momentum by doing that, and they really underestimated just how well I was able to deal with Suicune. They really underestimated how much time it would take for the Suicune to get to a point where it could threaten my entire team. And as I was alluding to before, that's something very important to do when playing setup sweepers. It's important to know what on your opponent's team can check your setup sweeper, whether that's a trick Choice Scarfmon, whether that's a phaser like Tentacruel or a Pokemon with Roar. That's what people mean when they say phaser, incidentally. It's a term that's somewhat fallen out of popularity recently, but a phaser is one that can remove the boost from a setup sweeper in some fashion. So that's another check to setup sweepers. They used to be more important when setup sweepers were better, like in previous gens or in the Baton Pass days. If you really want to see what a setup team looks like back then, you want to look at the Baton Pass ADV teams. Smogon is great for seeing that kind of old data. You can look back to a different era of Pokemon and see a lot of stuff that you don't see anymore. And I think for just kind of understanding the rich history of a great game like competitive Pokemon, that's a great tool. I've spent many afternoons just pouring through the data and kind of seeing what the game looked like before I was playing. But I don't mean to get too far off topic, and I think that's about what I wanted to cover for this game, actually. Just a PSA, if you didn't know, Latios has a form that's an anime girl. You should look that up if you haven't. It's pretty funny. It's named Bianca. It's in a mostly forgotten Pokemon movie. They made a lot of those in the mid-2000s. If anybody remembers the Pokemon 2000 movie, I still have my shiny Mew card from that. I think it's in my binder of mostly Magic cards. I keep it there because I think it's funny. Just to sort of opine for a moment, I think that is one of the great things about Pokemon. It's a game with so much emotional resonance for people, but is still deep enough to be played, with a full cognitive capacity as an adult who's interested in strategy games. And I think that's one of the things that makes it really great. So I won't take up any more of your time. I'll cut the video here. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any fun Pokemon to play from RU, NU, RUBL, things like that, please let me know. I'd love to hear it. Especially sort of kooky Mega evolutions, like, do you have any successful teams with a Mega Audino, for example? I hear that Pokemon's a real killer in NU or RU, and I've never seen anybody play it in UU. There's probably a reason for that, but success is where you find it. I'm playing Snorlax. This Pokemon is fine, but it's certainly not the most amazing Pokemon in UU, but it just feels so good to catch wins with it like this one. So if you have any suggestions like that, I'd love to hear it. Leave it in the comments below. Please subscribe if you've enjoyed my content so far, and I'll see you guys in the next one.